Alright, I'm going to try to do a walkthrough of my process for Tales from When I Had a Face. Hopefully this setup will work this time. I've had some troubles doing this. It's much easier for me to do the work, apparently, than to actually talk about it. I work with a 3-monitor setup. I make up all the monitors. You won't be able to see all of them, obviously. I have a camera on my Cintiq, which is where I do the actual drawing. Alright, so that. Oh, I'll turn the computer on. I'm going to load up first part of the book, which is the summer tree. I worked with Peter Emerson Williams on this part of the full page art for this section of the book. Each section of the book has a primary narrator, and I tried to marry the style, both of the collaboration and the artist I picked for that section, to the aesthetic of that text. Marrying the text and the images it's a different process with an illustrated novel in some ways than a comic. Aside from the comic sequential art sections of the book. Loading it up now. A lot of these files are almost a gigabyte when they're fully open, so even with my workstation, it takes a minute. Peter's style is it's very detailed. It's kind of almost like in a Baroque. I wanted this part of the section of this book to have a kind of early 19th century or late 19th century, early 20th century sort of vibe, kind of matching with Gran as the narrator. It's like almost 100 years old when she's telling the story. All right, so let's bring those into your view. So because of the the way these are done, I really had to work with them pretty much like a painting. I did it all by hand. There isn't really much or any flatting or gradients being done like I do with the comics because of the style of it, it wouldn't really work as well. But it does mean it's very time consuming. The pages, in the summer tree like this, it's probably about 40 hours of work for each one. When talking about process for these, it's kind of funny because I did have a pretty methodical practice with the winter tree and some of the later sections of the book where it matched the style. But with these, I'm like looking at my layers now, and they're not organized into folders. They're airbrush, top paint, light pencils, lighting, dark pencils, top ink, mid darkened paint, shadows, watercolor glaze, 10 layers of watercolor glaze. So breaking that down is not easy. A lot of it does, my process does involve a lot of going back and forth between multiply layers where I'm adding pigment that's darkening that area, and lighten or overlay or hard or soft light layers where I'm trying to add a sort of spectral element of like color lighting it in that region. You see the same thing with another image from that section of the book. Same deal. If I start turning layers off, you can see I've turned like 10 layers off already. All right, there we go. And now we're getting down to the pencils. Just the multiply layers of paint at the bottom. Underneath, turn those off, and you got the pencils. That's basically where I started, although I actually do some like manual touching up of his pencils a little bit because I can get a higher fidelity when I'm working with digital tools than he did all these by hand. They were scanned in. Right, so that's the first part of the book. Let's go on to the second. For the fall tree section of the book, that's part 2. Peter did the pencils for these also. I opted to go mostly black and white with this section of the book for the full page illustrations. The chapter headers and stuff are still in color. I'll get to those in a minute. Part of my decision to go black and white for this section is because it matches the tone of the story. The story gets pretty dark in the fall tree, grand story. And I thought that it would add a certain, kind of contrast against all the rest of the illustrations being black and white. I took a kind of more hands-off approach, working with his pencils. At this point, although I do intend to work into them a little more. I mean, really, all of these pages are still in progress, some more than others. You can see if I turn all of my layers off, you wind up with the pencils I got, which is pretty similar. I mean, I tightened a lot up and kind of brought out some highlights and some darker regions and stuff, and I want to keep doing that. But it's really just augmenting what he sent me. It's less of a sort of, full-on painting or collaboration of that sort. Which is kind of a lifesaver for me because the book in total has, almost 100 pages of full-color illustration, and it winds up being, talking 20 to 40 hours a page. So that's pretty much it as far as the process for the fall tree on my end. It's going to get a little more elaborate in terms of process when we get into the winter tree. And there's a pretty big style change there too. So let me jump into that too. In the winter tree, there are 2 primary sections of illustrations. One, Andu Abril sent me the inks for that. And those are full color illustrations kind of along the lines of what's in the summer tree or the fall tree, which is, full color opposite text. And I'll call up one of those examples to show you on the other screen. And so, yeah, you can see this is probably about 70% done. And like I said, these I was more methodical with. You see, like, without the inks give the structure and like sort of guidelines for where everything goes. These are the raw inks here. And I got a lot of information from Andy, which is really nice in terms of kind of where to place shadows and highlights. You see this line along the nose. I mean, at least to me, that reads as that part of the nose is in the light, and the rest of her face, especially in this area, is kind of in the shadows. The same with the sort of cragginess on the side of Gran's face. Of course, the left side of her face is supposed to be more cracked anyways. That's described in the text. There's a reason for that. But nevertheless, the way the lines are drawn around here, it gives me this sense of sort of an upwards glance, direction of the light. And sure enough, the fire is one of the major light sources in this area, although I also bring in a sort of like beam of light as if it's coming from the outside. All right, so I added a base layer, a gradient, just sort of a really subtle, from like a darker, just vaguely blue, purple up top to, more of the hues that are being cast by the light. And this is underneath the multiply layer of the inks, just to give a base. And then on top of that is where all the gradients come in and flats. And now I've basically I actually hand selected. When I started doing this process early on, I used the magic wand tool a lot more, and then as I got more comfortable with the Cintiq, and also as I discovered the difficulties of making those sort of selections, I just do them by hand at this point and just trace the outline for the most part, and then do a little bit of shaping on the selection, and boom, there it is. The cool thing with it, doing it that way with vectors instead of the paint bucket is that, if I wanted to, or if I had a reason to, whatever, I can go in and change any of those hues later. It's all editable. It's not, with one of the paintings with Peter's section, if I was like, oh, I want to have more red throughout the illustration or whatever, that means basically, I could try to work a gradient in, but if I was going to do it by the same style, it would actually mean just, hours of painting, whereas here it'd be click. So anyways, On top of that, I built in all the paint layers, and this is a composite of light pencils and several layers of oil, several layers of graphite, several layers of watercolor, some lights that are being cast from the fire that I wanted to go under the painting, as opposed to on top of that. Then there's another folder of lights that go on top of the painting gradients and stuff. I really try to create a sort of spectral effect. I've been really getting into that and the sort of iridescence, and a lot of that comes from having base tones and colors, and then playing with either complementary or opposite colors off of it. Or sometimes, it's like you have like an orange base. If you can go purple with it, but it can also be interesting when you go at some clashing colors, but you do it really subtly, so it doesn't turn to mud. So I've played with that a lot for these. Now the second section, as I said, there's two sections of illustrations in the Winter Tree. The other is a more comic format, and those I got inks from Krista Salvatore. Here's one page. This one is actually probably a little less comic format than the others. This chronicles Aita's transition through the underworld. So the format shift is pretty intentional. It's the section of the book where she's traveling through the underworld seems like a good place to introduce a sequential comic art style. For these, it's pretty similar to the method with Andu's stuff. Okay, so here's the inks. Really graceful kind of motion going downwards in the page that helped direct me the flow of the text and everything. And then underneath the inks, that is a multiply layer, all the gradients. Again, using the same sort of mentality of, sometimes I like to create a gradient where you're not having a value shift. It's not darker in one spot than the other. It's actually a hue shift. But it can create the illusion of depth, especially when you go into it later with paints, and that's part of what kind of plays out that iridescent look. I am going to have to work on it a bit in terms of print. I'm not sure how much of that's going to translate, because it works, the iridescence works really well on a screen. It just pops out. On print, it really depends on the print process, and even in the best case, it's usually not quite as sort of translucent. It all has a sort of like an opaque quality to it, because it's ink on paper. But I'm gonna. it's all a work in process. We'll see what happens. Yep. Now, paint layers again. Combination of graphite, gouache, oils, watercolors, etc. And then some lights over the moons, like the light that's being cast by them, and then the text layer. Later on in this section of the book, there are word balloons and stuff and dialogue, but this early on, all the dialogue, at least currently, and I think I'm going to stick with it, is worked into the background, because this is all sort of Aita's internal journey, really, into the underworld. And then the final section of the book, the Spring Tree, is shorter than the others, much like spring oftentimes is. It's winter, you're dreaming for the spring to come. Yay, it's spring for 2 weeks, and then fuck, it's summer. It kind of has that sort of vibe, even in terms of the story. So there is a little less art. This was done by Andu, a lot of it. There are some of the art for Spring Tree is also based on 3D models sent to me by Alexei Andreev. And I have some sort of collage and like almost installation pieces I might work in, where I built this wooden box that had like a pig heart in it that was like, it had an armature of copper wiring and all this stuff. I did it for a Kickstarter art project a while ago, but I think it might actually work. So we'll see with that. I'm not going to show that right now because I don't know where the files are. I think it's in another folder. But I do have Andu's stuff here. Let's cop one of it. She used a slightly different style for this section than she did in Winter. So it's all pencils and Let me go down to the original, just the pencils. All right, so yeah, these are pencils. No inks. It's got a little bit more of an kind of light vibe to it. I wanted to go with that, so I'm not inking really, barely at all. I might add a little bit of sharpness in some areas with an ink, but for the most part, I'm gonna leave it with that look and go more in with beyond where I have here, and keep building up on the same lines with watercolor. And I might use a little pastels in this section, which I haven't earlier, which is just a slightly different texture, really, when you get down to it. I'm doing digital brushes anyways. For this project, I mostly use Kyle's brushes, and they're pretty popular. In fact, when I got them, they were, I just bought them from him directly, but I think they've actually been incorporated into the Adobe suite. I haven't actually fiddled around with that too much. I spend so much time sort of working on these projects, just like scribbling away, a lot of times I keep being like, oh, I should go back and, put some time into doing like a full tutorial in Photoshop. I've been using it for 20 years, and at this point my process is so kind of idiosyncratic, and I'm sure I probably don't use half of what, I could be using in the application, but it's always like, all right, but I could also be like actually working on a page right now. So then that's what I wind up doing. Maybe after I finish Tails, we'll see. maybe then I will finally do a long tutorial just in the application rather than trying to use it right away to do something. That's kind of been my process for learning most apps, is like I have to do this project. I feel like whenever I have a project that gets a hold of me like this one, I just have to do it. It's not a question. And then it's like, well, I don't have to know how to do X, Y, and Z. So then, I kind of just brute force my way through it. And then I learn how to do it for that project. But a lot of times that doesn't necessarily give me a sort of, broader ability to use that application or that style for like anything, And this is just bigger picture stuff, but it's the same way I go at music production. There's a couple of guitars in the shot. Been working on albums off and on for years, but also there too, it's I wish I had the focus to kind of just spend 3 years, digging in on that and doing it quote unquote right, but instead it's like, no, I want to do this project right now. So that's my process. I'm not saying it's the right or wrong process, but it's part of what produces the results that we get. So yeah, those are the 4 parts of the books. I didn't talk through the chapter heading art. Those were done by Chris, or the inks were, and I'll show this real quick. There are like 14 or 15 of these, and they go under the chapter heading. So let's drop these into a folder. All right. Okay, so the inks. These I just did gradients and flats. I didn't want to go in with the watercolor or the gouache or anything. I wanted to be really clean and just, boom. Of course that's, I don't know, 15 layers of gradients or whatever. And the proper way usually is to flat, and by flat that means you go in and you get the flat colors that are your base tone and hue for that area. I sometimes cheat a little bit and just go straight in with a gradient, but the probably better way in a lot of ways is to set those base colors and then apply a gradient on top of it through one of the blending modes in Photoshop. I do that sometimes too, especially if there's like a lot of, especially for light layers, like if there's a bunch of different areas that are very different, hues, but then all of them are under the light of a torch or something, that I'm gonna, do the light from the torch as a separate layer. I do enjoy playing with light. Sometimes with a book like this, it's really fun because you can, it's fantasy, so you can get a little bit unrealistic with how reflective a surface is, or the light sourcing and whatnot. Like I am not super strict with that. I definitely pay attention to lighting, a lot of attention to lighting, because it's like all of it when it comes to painting, the way I go at it. But and that produces that sense of depth. but it doesn't mean it's necessarily realistic in terms of, I mean, unless if you know, a lot of these shots, it's like they would have, you know, gel lights and stuff. You're going to try to reproduce it with photography, which is a method I've been getting into a lot lately, but that's a subject for a different video. So yeah, I guess that's basically the process for the visual art for Tales. There are also a bunch of chapter images that are digital paintings of mine, but those are pretty much follow the same process as the other sections. It's just that I'm the one who's doing the I'm doing it from the beginning. You know, I'm not working from someone else's inks or pencils. And for those, I use a lot of reference photos. I mean, like a lot. There isn't any one face or, you know, structure or animal or anything that's just like one animal just copied over by, you know, traced, and then but it's usually a composite of multiple sources. You know, I guess technical term for that would be photo bashing, except that the photo bashing itself isn't the painting. It's like the underpainting. It's the structure that I'm building on top of, and then a lot of times I pull that underpainting out entirely. Or if I do keep it, I'll keep it at the very bottom, like with like a 20% opacity or something, just to give it that extra kind of weight, which I could do by hand, just painting in. But that's, you know, saving myself a couple extra hours on a painting that's already taking 30 hours. So yeah, that's my process.